All right, Joonatan, go ahead and start representing clinical relevant medication knowledge.
Yeah, that I'll do. So, I'm Joonatan from Vuorinen Publishing Company. It's the publishing arm of the Finnish Medical Society Vuorinen. We work mostly on the clinical reasoning module, so practice guidelines, EBM, decision support, things like that. But the topic for today is especially the medication knowledge bases. And the scope, what I mean by this clinically relevant medication knowledge, it could also be called like clinical particulars of medications. It's the part of the CRMI implementation guide, or the Canonical Resource Management Infrastructure implementation guide, which has these sort of context-free resources or definitional resources that don't really relate to any given patient, but instead just model knowledge. So there's this section of domain artifacts that also contain medication, particularly the medication knowledge resource there. And from the perspective of the FHIR levels or the FHIR modules, there's the clinical reasoning, that's like the main focus of Vuorinen. And in the FHIR version R5, the new module of medication definition was introduced, which is mostly for the regulatory side of things. But it also contains, at this sort of intersection, some resources that have more to deal with clinical decision support and the clinical particulars of medications. And that's the interesting part here. And if we zoom into the medication definition module, it has this sort of graphic that on the top there is these sort of daily prescribing scenarios. So the normal like medication requests and medication that you deal with within EHRs, for example. And on the bottom side, there's the marketing authorizations and sort of workflows that take place in given medicines agencies. For example, in Europe, we have the EMA. In Finland, there's a FIMEA, which is the Finnish Medicines Agency. I think FDA does similar things in the States. But on the left side, there's once more these clinically relevant resource types, so medication knowledge and clinical use definitions. And that's peculiar in the sense that it's not necessarily, owned by either one of these parties. So not necessarily by the prescription centers or the authorities that are involved with prescribing, and not necessarily for the jurisdictions or the medicines agencies that deal with the regulatory side for marketing authorizations and things of that nature. But instead, knowledge bases, drug databases for interactions, things of this nature. So in short, what I mean by this clinically relevant medication knowledge for today, it's medication knowledge and clinical use definition resources. As a concrete example, let's look at an open data classification from the Finnish Medicines Agency FIMEA called the Med75+, which is a classification for drug substances that classifies the substances for their suitability for older adults. As the name implies, it's for those who are over 75 years of age. And it classifies them onto 4 different classes or levels, from A to D, A being the ones that are suitable substances for the adults, B being the ones that are either inclusive evidence or that are insufficiently effective. C is those that are suitable with specific precautions, and D is those that are best to be avoided. The actual classification itself isn't authored or published in FHIR. Instead, it's this sort of proprietary XML model. But the important part of that is that it contains this sort of identification part of both the specific ingredient, which is classified, and the active substances. We'll look at the relationship between these two in a second. Then there's the classification itself, that being the A, B, C, or D, and a recommendation that further elaborates or gives comments on why that classification is applied. There's also the date of classification, and in the end, there's a list of the products that contain this particular specific ingredient. So in Finland and in most of the Nordics, the way that products are, or medical products are identified is by something called the Nordic Article Number, or VNR. It's a 6-digit code that points to a particular product that has a market authorization. The active substances of these products are classified using ATC. And a particular thing to note about ATC is for combinations especially, it has this single code, which means that we also do have the specific ingredients that are identified by a separate substance identifier that point out, for example, in this case, the specific ingredient that we mean in this combination. The data can be mapped. For example, we use Fire shorthand as an intermediary format here, just for the sake of having something nice in version control that can be read. But you can see here that we map the VNR, or the Nordic article numbers, to the identifier. The ATC codes to the code field. The classification naturally goes into medicine classification. And then the ingredient is the definitional ingredient of that particular medication knowledge. Some things to note: the products, in this case the VNR numbers, change much, much quicker than the substances themselves. For example, in Finland, the available, or the products that are for sale, are updated bi-weekly, when the kinds of substances that come from the European Pharmacopoeia are updated 3 times a year, so almost quarterly. So there's quite a bit of difference in the cadence of these updating cycles. So it may be worthwhile to think about separating that, especially if you're working with multiple jurisdictions, so that you don't have to update the whole medication knowledge whenever a new product comes to market. And as mentioned earlier, if you're using ATC to find out or identify the active ingredients, this introduces that ambiguity for combination drugs, meaning that you'll need a different substance identifier as well. That's not necessarily the case using some different code systems, SNOMED-CT, RxNorm, things like that. Especially in Europe, there's this UNICOM project going on, and relating to that, for example, the European Medicines Agency has this SPOR project for various kinds of data management services, particularly here the product management service and substance management service, which might end up becoming the canonical master data for these identifying concerns, at least in the European Union. All right, switching gears and looking at the actual classification itself. As mentioned, it's a letter from A to C, in this case C, suitable for older adults with specific precautions. And it has this recommendation part which further elaborates, having these clinical particulars like for short-term use only, do not use in severe renal impairment, increases swelling, and the like. The kind of naive or the easiest way of representing these classifications could be with a code system where you have 2 levels of hierarchy, the first being just these 4 steps A, B, C, D for the classification, and the second level that then introducing the recommendation as well, just as plain text. The pros of that: you get a workable knowledge base, don't really need any other resources, just the medication knowledge and a code system. Also, it can be machine generated without having to change or do any additional modeling on the source data. Medication knowledge and the code system both map well to the CRMI profiles that exist today. And also it maps quite well to the search parameters on medication knowledge. And given that all of the important information, or all the, let's say, textual information is included in a code system, localization is also quite easy. But the one glaring con of this approach is that it misses the opportunity of actually modeling those clinical particulars contained in the recommendation as structured resources. And for that, we can use the other clinically relevant resource type, that being the clinical use definition. And the previous bullet points, like for short-term only, do not use in severe renal impairment, things like that. We can go and model warnings, contraindications, undesirable effects, all of these different types of clinical use definitions. So here, for example, we have a contraindication for the severe renal impairment and an undesirable effect for the swelling. So the pros of that is that you really do get a knowledge base that contains all of the clinical particulars of the medications that you know of. And when there are some ambiguities, you can use the warning type of clinical use definition, which allows you to have some, well, not entirely unstructured, but it serves as a kind of escape hatch. For example, you can just plonk the whole recommendation as a single warning as a starting point. And this introduces some reuse across medication knowledge resources. But the con here is that it takes quite a bit of modeling effort, especially for the terminology side of things, where you have to find the matching concepts. Now, the obligatory like AI, LLM mention here is that, yes, you could probably use some kind of generative AI to ingest, for example, the SPCs, the summaries of product characteristics, and find the clinical particulars from there. I know of some approaches that are already being explored in that space. A more of a technical note, clinical use definitions currently have a reference as a subject to a particular substance or a medication instead of a coding. So you'll need some kind of a substance register where you have these FHIR resources that you can point to. For example, we at DevDays, we have somewhere around 2,000 different substances that we deal with in these kinds of prescribing support use cases. And clinical use definition is not a part of CRMI, but I don't really see any point why it couldn't be. Now that you have a knowledge base, it can be wrapped with the CDS hook service, if that's a use case that you want to support. It can be nice, especially for the kinds of systems that are not FHIR native. And the quite obvious choices of hooks to use here are either the order select or order sign, perhaps even both. But to repeat, it's very important here that you have some kind of mechanism for identifying the authored medication knowledge from the incoming medication requests. So, for example, in Finland, this would be the Nordic article numbers and of the ATC codes. So, for some takeaways, at least for the time being, third-party medication knowledge bases are necessary. Even though there are these projects like SPL FHIR in the States, and the European Union has the whole EPI, the electronic product information projects, there's still, those do contain some of the clinical particulars, but not things like interactions and contraindications. So if those are necessary, then you'll still need some kind of knowledge base to do that. CRMI serves as a good starting point for authoring. I think it's a great thing for all kinds of authored artifacts, not just medication knowledge. And to reiterate one more time, it's very important, especially if you're dealing with multiple jurisdictions, that you have a sensible way of mapping your authored medication knowledge to the actual medication knowledge that is, or the actual medications that are prescribed. And as a final little bonus point, a knowledge base might be considered, at least in the European Union, as a simple search instead of a full-blown medical device, because it's just doing these queries and not serving any kind of actual service for you. But your mileage may vary, so don't take that as a promise. You can contact me on chatfire.org or by email or, well, on GitHub if you're technical. Time for some questions.
Hi, thanks. Did you consider using the medication definition resources instead of medication knowledge, like medicinal product definition, to represent the same data? Is there some reason for that choice? Because things like SPORE and the SPL on FHIR are tending to use a product definition for things like classifications and so on, rather than medication knowledge at the moment?
Yeah, there's no like particular difference there that I've seen. It's mostly about, you know, aligning with the bigger picture where the medication knowledge. Well, I'll show you the slide. Perhaps it makes more sense there. Here, the prescribing support is like explicitly. It's a little small, so it's hard to see. But on the orange box there, that's like precisely medication knowledge resource. So using that as a guide for what kind of resources might be used for these kinds of knowledge bases. That's the basis there, but I don't see why it couldn't be at another resource type as well.
Yeah, that was kind of the original plan, but it's sort of panned out a bit that
Right.
people have tended to go for the green ones on the right, because there are some cases where you need all that stuff.
Right.
And so if you're going to need it sometimes, you kind of might as well go for it always. That's what's tended to happen so far.
Right. Good point.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you.
Thank you.